Hello everyone, and welcome to the 162nd episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan. You've all been waiting for this one, and it's time I delivered. As the title suggests, in this video, we're going to be exploring the moral designation of the central character of one of the greatest stories ever told in the manga anime medium, looking to his actions, motivations, goals, and the circumstances that formed him into the person he is, so we can attempt to answer one of the most asked questions whenever this series is mentioned. Is Eren Yeager evil? Now typically I offer an overview of many of the important details of any series I cover, but because this series is rather complex, I think doing so here would add unnecessary length to this video. I could devote a large chunk of this video to spelling out the details of this series, as well as Eren's character, to either refresh your memory or give context to what I'm saying for people watching this video who haven't seen Attack on Titan. But I'm not going to do that for a very specific reason, and that's because, and spoiler alert here, you don't really arrive at the question of whether or not Eren is evil until you get towards the end of this story. So if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you have seen this series to completion, and because that's the case, I'm not going to go into explicit detail about all of the events and lore surrounding Eren's actions or motivations, as most if not all of you will find that unnecessary. So yes, you might find yourself a little lost if you haven't seen this series, but if you haven't, perhaps what I discuss here will spur you to finally give it a watch or a read. Now just as Isayama intended, many things in this story are left up to interpretation, and that includes Eren's moral designation. And with that in mind, this video is my interpretation of what influenced the events that occurred in this story and whether or not Eren is evil as a result of those events. There's a slim chance that everything I say in this video is 100% correct, and you might find yourself agreeing with me quite a lot, but more likely than not, you're going to agree with some of what I have to say, or maybe even none of what I have to say, though hopefully I'm not so woefully off here that everything I say is completely wrong. But that's the beauty of interpretive works, and as much as I'd like it to be the case, I'm not necessarily looking to prove my interpretation of this story as the one true end-all be-all of morality in Attack on Titan. I'm simply offering that interpretation to you, and I encourage all of you to challenge anything I say here down below. But first, let's talk about our sponsor for this video, Keeps. Keeps is an affordable and discreet online subscription service that offers clinically proven treatments designed to fight against the symptoms of hair loss from the comfort of your own home. Chances are, you or someone you know has experienced some form of hair loss, as 2 out of 3 men will unfortunately experience hair loss by the time they turn 35. With the help of Keeps though, that hair loss becomes preventable and even reversible, as Keeps is formulated to both stop hair loss in its tracks while stimulating new hair growth. But don't just take my word for it. There are thousands of testimonies from thousands of customers who have found success in combating hair loss with Keeps. Success that you can see in before and after pictures that are on your screen now. With the help of Keeps licensed medical providers, you'll choose products and treatments that are specific to your type of hair that are easily added to your routine without having to ever visit a doctor's office or pharmacy. Their products are delivered straight to your door in discreet packaging. And for any and all needs regarding Keeps, you have access to 24/7 support that includes a network of medical advisors, prescribers, and care specialists that are ready to assist you. Don't let your follicle insecurities rule your life, as hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get started, go to keeps.com/file or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/file to get your special offer with Keeps today. Thank you, Keeps, for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. There are several aspects of Eren's development that formed him into the boy who would eventually resolve himself to enact a worldwide genocide. Namely, his existence inside the walls of Parody, his desire to leave those walls, his mother's death at the hands of the Titans, and his father's injection of both the Attack and Founding Titans into Eren's body. Eren showed himself to be a willful, tenacious, and idealistic young man. And prior to the time skip, Eren wasn't really a bad person. However, there are a few questionable actions that he took. He murdered 2 men to save Mikasa, but he did so in self-defense and in the defense of another innocent. And though it shows his willingness to commit violent acts against others at a young age, it isn't exactly a crime. He frequently displayed a desire to eradicate all the Titans, but who within the walls didn't? You could say that his fight with Annie in the capital city was a questionable action when you consider that their fight caused the deaths of innocents, but that was more of a rash and reckless decision than a willful act of malice. And the same could be said for his willingness to feed himself to Astoria in the cavern below the church. He certainly was angsty and full of rage, and the murders he committed as a child could indicate that he has some sort of personality disorder. But as far as crimes are concerned, Eren's actions pre-time skip were relatively inoffensive, foolhardy, reckless, and ignorant, but inoffensive nonetheless. With that in mind, what we're really trying to examine here is Eren's actions after the time skip. And in order to do so, we first need to examine some aspects of perhaps the most important figure to ever exist in this world, Ymir. Now, one thing we need to ask ourselves right away is whether or not Ymir is evil. With the varied mixture of predetermination and ambiguous free will we're given in this series, we have several ways that we could potentially find an answer to this question. If everything that happened to the people of this world, and all the actions that Eren took to save the Eldian people were predetermined by Ymir, then Ymir could be considered evil, but I would probably call her tragically broken, and perhaps possibly naive more than anything. If there's anyone who deserves to be called evil in the story of Ymir, it's the first King Fritz, the man who killed her parents, burned down her village, cut her tongue out, kept her in bondage, and used her for her powers to further his dynasty and the power of his new Eldian empire. A man who wanted the Titans to dominate the earth so the Eldians could rule it for the rest of time. Now, one of the most peculiar moments we're given in this series is when Eren proclaims that Ymir loved King Fritz, but this isn't actually too far-fetched of a statement. After her parents were killed and her village was burned down, Ymir became a slave who only ever had the attention her master showed her to look to for a human connection. And when someone is so heavily abused, they often form what might seem to those who haven't experienced abuse to be an odd attachment to the person who has brought them so much pain. Also, Fritz gave Ymir a sense of purpose, not just through the children she had with him, but through the use of her powers to further her people's civilization. And in an incredibly warped way, Ymir owes her existence as this divine figure to Fritz, as she would not have stumbled upon the so-called source of all living matter without his influence. Of course, if Fritz hadn't made her his slave and used her in the way he did, she likely would have led her own fulfilling life bereft of abuse and slavery. But she didn't. And because that's the case, it's reasonable to assume that Ymir derived much of her self-worth from Fritz. So despite the abuse she suffered at the hands of this barbaric king and her fellow Eldians, Ymir did not want to see the people who she had come to care for in the vision of her husband destroyed, and so she was willing to continue embodying the will of King Fritz long after he had perished, for the sake of the Eldians. However, she also seemed to be aware on some level that who they were and the titaness power she had granted them was poisoning the world, and through the paths, Ymir eventually sought to free the Eldians and the rest of humanity of this curse disguised as a blessing, while also keeping them safe. So while Ymir likely had the power to alter the course of the events that led up to the rumbling in various ways, she didn't want to compromise their safety or their prosperity. It was her ability to see into the future alongside her abusive connection to her people that prevented her from coming to any other conclusion. As to this love-starved slave girl, her main priority was ensuring the safety and prosperity of her people, no matter what. It's more than likely that Ymir, after sifting through an infinite number of scenarios, determined that Eren's eventual enactment of the rumbling, alongside Mikasa's slaying of him, a woman who loved a wretched creature, like Ymir loved a wretched creature, was the only way to save both humanity and the Eldians, which I believe was an incredibly misguided decision that was influenced by the detrimental aspects of her character that were imposed upon her by her abusers. But if the rumbling was the path to humanity's salvation, why did she have to wait so long for it to occur? Because she didn't have access to a proper vessel to embody her designs, a person who not only shared her power, but understood her. Eren understands Ymir's plight more than any other person who possessed the Founding Titan before him. Considering Zeke was able to view Ymir's backstory alongside Eren, we can assume that every member of the Fritz family who possessed the power of the Founding Titan was privy to her backstory as well. However, just like Zeke and the first King of the Walls, they interpreted her story incorrectly. Zeke, Karl Fritz, and his successors all immediately looked to the horror of the world Ymir crafted with her powers, and sought to bring an end to it, without truly understanding why she continued to facilitate the Titan's powers. When they saw Ymir, they saw a wraith bound to the past who they assumed was essentially a slave much as she was during her lifetime, only now she was a slave to the will of the first King Fritz, and the paths. I imagine they either assumed that Ymir had no choice in following the will of the first king, and saw his abuse of her powers in the world he created as evil, or if she did have a choice, that she chose to carry out his will despite all the suffering it caused, which were grounds for the retreat to parody, as well as Zeke's euthanization plan. Likewise, all the possessors of the Founding Titan who came before Karl Fritz, and furthered the power of the Eldian Empire, viewed their power in Ymir's story through a similar lens as the first King Fritz. Their power was a divine gift that allowed them to be the veritable gods of this world, or more appropriately, appointed them the gods of this world, and it was their sacred duty to uphold and further the empire of their progenitor. Neither of these groups of individuals ever attempted to understand the girl who had found this power. They never looked to Ymir as more than a vessel for the might of the Titans and the dominance of the Eldian Empire, and because they viewed her that way, they only thought to either end what she had begun or continue it. In reality, Ymir wanted to do both. She wanted to ensure that the people she loved would experience a blissful existence, but she also knew that the power she had unleashed upon the world was a blight. So for the voiceless Ymir, who could not share her designs with the possessors of the Founding Titan, she was forced to resort to relying on her future sight to foretell who the person best suited to carrying out her designs would be, and then orchestrate the events of the world in the best way she could, so the course of history would be steered towards its acquirement of the Founding Titan and the Attack Titan. Why she saw the rumbling as necessary in the first place is because in order to enable Eren's acquirement of both these titans, 2,000 years of Eldian hegemony would have to plague the world, which would then result in the persecution of Eldians by the rest of the world once the Eldian Empire was defeated, and their eventual genocide at the hands of the Marleyans. Knowing that the Eldians at this point would be incredibly vulnerable if they lost the power of the Titans, she wanted to ensure that they would thrive after they lost the Titans, and not succumb to the hatred they cultivated over 2,000 years. If the Titans continued to exist, the world would never know any sort of peace. But likewise, if the world that had experienced the terror of the Titans was allowed to exist, the Eldians would be persecuted as living devils until the last member of their race stopped breathing. And so was born the compromise the rumbling provided. With 80% of the world's population and the Titans gone, the Eldians would be given enough breathing room to establish a strong enough nation that could withstand any attacks from other nations while they recuperated from the loss of the Titans. And it's feasible that enough people from each nation managed to survive the rumbling, which would allow them to eventually re-establish their own nations without their previous biases towards the Eldian people in place, thus healing the world by nearly breaking it. Now, all of this wouldn't prevent them from forming new biases, but with this plan, at the very least, I imagine that Ymir hoped that the Eldians wouldn't be targeted as world-destroying devils who needed to be eradicated now that they no longer had the power of the Titans, which would give the world a greater chance at moving past any animosities their respective ancestors might have had prior to the rumbling. Now, why Eren would be the first person to understand Ymir is because of the conditions surrounding his parentage and upbringing, which enabled him to have similar experiences to Ymir, and because his brotherhood with Zeke allowed him to become the first non-royal possessor of the founding Titan, who was unbound by the will of the Fritz family. Eren never experienced what it means to be a slave in the literal sense, but he knew what it was like to be a prisoner stuck in a cage with his loved ones and live with the threat of beasts clawing at that cage who might one day break through its bars and slaughter everyone he loved, which in a way made him, and everyone else within the walls, a slave to the Titan threat. His pain is similar to Ymir's in the sense that he loved his friends, family, and fellow Eldians more than anything, but he also understood that the power they had been granted was detrimental to not only the entire world, but the Eldians themselves. One of the more defining aspects of Eren's development of Ymir-like qualities was his desire for freedom and to see the world outside the walls. Eren had dreamed of a wild world filled with natural wonders that he could scarcely imagine, and once he came in contact with a civilized world, the joy of experiencing anything the outside world had to offer him was severely dampened. Alongside the dreaded threat of the Titans that he had endured for so long, he had to contend with the human threats that lived outside the walls. Thus, Eren's desire to eliminate the enemies of his people, the Titans, transformed into a desire to eliminate the newly discovered enemies of his people, the rest of humanity, which then led him to accepting the rumbling. And in this way, Eren is similar to Ymir in that she wanted to provide a safe and free world in which her people could thrive. So now, with everything we've discussed regarding Ymir in mind, we've come to one of the most important questions surrounding Eren's character. Did Eren have any choice in becoming the vessel for the rumbling? In other words, does Eren have free will? Let's take a look at a question Isayama was asked on the topic. Eren says in the final episode of the anime that he had no choice but to follow the future that he saw, that he was powerless against the powers of the founding Titan. Armin even asks if he's really free. Was he telling the truth, or do you see this as him telling an excuse? So the truth is, the situation with Eren actually overlaps in a certain sense with my own story with this manga. When I first created this series, I was worried that it would probably be cancelled. It was a work that no one knew about, but I had already started the story with the ending in mind, and the story ended up being read and watched by an incredible number of people, and it led to me being given a huge power that I didn't quite feel comfortable with. It would have been nice if I could have changed the ending. Writing manga is supposed to be freeing, but if I was completely free, then I should have been able to change the ending. I could have changed it and said I wanted to go in a different direction, but the fact is that I was tied down to what I had originally envisioned when I was young. And so manga became a very restrictive art form for me, similar to how the massive powers that Eren acquired ended up restricting him. What I get from this answer is that Eren has a certain degree of free will. This makes sense when you consider that Eren admits that he wasn't given a full view of the future ahead of him, but despite that fact, he was heavily influenced by Ymir's designs. I think Eren was capable of still fulfilling Ymir's designs in a less drastic way had he not given in to the notion that the future he was granted access to was an inevitability rather than just a possibility. However, it is possible that Eren was only given the illusion of free will by Ymir, and she only showed him what was necessary to bring her plans to fruition, and thus Eren was preordained to make these choices, regardless of whether or not he was given knowledge of everything that would occur, though I think that might be quite the stretch. So if we're going to assume that Eren actually does have a certain degree of free will, there's a couple things to consider here. Eren could have chosen to abandon his responsibilities as a Titan and run away with Mikasa like she envisioned prior to slaying him, but that would have only prolonged the Titan problem and potentially shouldered the burden of enacting the rumbling upon another worthy vessel after perhaps even more millennia of waiting. And while that doesn't solve the Titan problem, it does solve the Eren succumbing to evil problem. However, the probability of that actually happening was likely quite low. So I believe one of the best avenues to understanding in what way Eren could have deviated from Ymir's design successfully can be found in Zeke's euthanization plan. Part of Zeke's plan involved the decapitation of the world's military capabilities to buy parity some time. If they were going to do this, and Zeke's plan was to ask Ymir to alter the bodies of the Eldians so they were unable to breed any longer, would it have been possible to ask Ymir to revoke the Eldians' capabilities to become Titans? If she has the power to alter minds and bodies, I don't see why that would be a problem. And if they did eliminate the outside military threat, a few decades to buy the Eldians time to bolster their own forces would have been feasible. The world would have of course rearmed itself eventually, and it's possible that they still would have hated the Eldians for their past sins and warred with them until they were eradicated, despite the Titans no longer being a threat. But as we see at the end of this series, it wouldn't have really mattered all too much, as conflict was bound to happen anyway, whether or not the rumbling occurred. Though admittedly, that was an unknown to the Eldians that they possibly couldn't have predicted, which would have weakened the odds of this plan happening. But regardless, it seems that the exact same goal that the rumbling would have achieved could have been realized without the enormous loss of life that it caused. It is entirely possible that Ymir wasn't able to take the power of the Titans away from the Eldians, and it could be that the only way to take that power away was to slay the bearer of the founding Titan alongside the source of all living matter, which is something that the speechless Ymir was unable to communicate, which would mean that her designs were truly the only way forward. There is something that might poke a hole in Ymir's inability to communicate though, that being whether or not she knew how to read and write. If Ymir isn't able to speak, it's possible that she could have just explained everything necessary to the Titan's destruction by writing it out for whoever possessed the founding Titan. Though even as the wife of a king, it's not unreasonable to assume that Ymir was never taught nor learned how to read or write. And because this seems like a significant plot hole, I think it's best that we assume this is the case. Though it could be that despite her ability to write, she refused to explain the nature of her grand design, which would also patch that hole up. So if the death of the founding Titan and the source of all living matter was the prerequisite for the elimination of the Titans, is it possible that Eren and the rest of the Eldians could have figured this out without having to take the preordained path of Ymir? That's a big old maybe. But we have to ask ourselves, once the founding Titan and the source of all living things were eliminated, did this automatically release the Eldians from their connection to Ymir and her powers? Or were the conditions created by the rumbling, and Mikasa's macabre display of love for Eren that Ymir desired, a requirement for her to manually relinquish her power, and the Eldians' connection to the paths? In other words, unless Ymir willed it, would the Eldians ever have been able to free themselves from the Titan's curse? Maybe. There are so many variables in this story that it's hard to accurately predict which outcome would be preferable or even possible, so determining whether the rumbling was something that could be prevented or not seems impossible given all the information that we currently have about this world, the Eldians, and the powers of Ymir and the Titans. Genocide is obviously wrong, but from what I've seen in this story, we really have no way of knowing whether or not the rumbling was avoidable. I would like to think that it's possible that Eren and the rest of the Eldians could have figured out that killing the founding Titan and the source of all living matter would have solved their Titan problem, and formulated some plan that didn't require genocide. In the same vein as his fight with Annie in the capital, Eren's decision to accept the future he's presented with is in a way impulsive, as though he took his time weighing whether he should or shouldn't initiate the rumbling. It would seem that he never even attempted to formulate an alternative plan. He only saw the future and assumed it was inevitable no matter what he did. And perhaps if Eren hadn't just presented the inevitability of the rumbling to his friends when he spoke to them in the paths, and had them help him formulate some sort of plan as a team, as they had many times in the past, then perhaps things would have turned out much differently. And Eren's unwillingness to explain what he'd seen in full to his friends and rely on them for support is one of his greatest failures. So were the only other real alternative plans to Eren's that were presented within this story the 145th King of Eldia's resignation of his people's fate to eventual genocide by the Marleyans, and Zeke's euthanization plan better ideas? Technically, considering both would have resulted in less immediate loss of life, but if King Fritz's plan had been realized, a genocide would have still occurred. And if Zeke's plan had been realized, you would also be erasing the birth of potentially hundreds of millions, if not billions, who would have been born over the course of human history, which isn't right either. What would be a good plan then? Well, maybe that derivative of the euthanization plan as I explained a moment ago, but I'm not entirely sure what the best alternative would have been to the rumbling given everything that we've discussed. And if you have an idea, let us know down below. Now that we've arrived at this point, it's time that we answer the question that we've been building up to. Is Eren Yeager an evil person? So if we consider that Eren's decision to follow Ymir's designs instead of attempting to formulate his own plan could be more so a result of the more negative aspects of his character that I mentioned earlier, namely his rage, negligence, recklessness, naivete, and ignorance, and not a true display of willful malice, then maybe not. If everything he did was preordained, and he had absolutely no choice in both becoming who he is and doing what he did, then no, he isn't. While some of what Eren's done can be blamed on flaws in his character and his lack of worldly experience due to his age and other influences in his life, I don't think that absolves him of his sins. And as we've already discussed, I don't think that what he did was entirely predetermined. Instead, he's experiencing a combination of predetermination and free will. If Eren did have complete free will, then despite the fact that he was conditioned into taking this path, as well as the fact that he claimed that he viewed a number of futures where the rumbling still happened and thought it inevitable, he's evil, as though he tried in some ways to prevent the rumbling. I doubt that he viewed every infinite possibility, and therefore, he was pretty quick to give in to a genocidal plan that would have given his loved ones and his people the clean and wild world that he and Armin had imagined in their youth, despite the immense suffering he would cause to others, which is pretty damn evil, as obliterating the world's population to provide security, safety, and happiness for your own people is as heartless as it is twistedly selfless, to love your people so much that you'd murder everyone else on the planet for their sake. Then of course we have to consider what he did outside of the rumbling and what he admitted to doing, like killing his mother, manipulating his father into killing the Rice family, his massacre at Liberio, his manipulation of the Yeagerists, pushing away Armin and Mikasa in order to facilitate his plan, throwing his friends into danger despite not knowing whether they would die or not, and last, but definitely not least, that he actually wanted to destroy humanity, even if the rumbling could have been prevented, just so he could see the blood-soaked world he would create. So if Eren chose to do even a couple of these things of his own free will, Eren is an evil person. The only thing that could potentially absolve Eren of his sins is if everything in this world was predetermined, not just Ymir's designs. If the origin of all living things is God, or a God created the origin, and they predetermined the events of this world, then we could consider whichever God rules this world to be evil. However, if that God is the supreme deity of this universe, then ultimately they would decide what is good and what is evil. That doesn't necessarily prevent us from decrying our own suffering at the hands of a cruel God as evil, but depending on your point of view, what we have to say on the matter is superseded by this God's authority and is therefore irrelevant. So with everything we've discussed in mind, as well as all the ambiguity present in this story, my tentative interpretation of Eren's moral character is that he is in fact evil, but depending on whether or not we're given further information about this story in the future, that could change. In that same vein, at the end of Attack on Titan, the outlook for this universe is tentatively promising. 1,000 years from now in our own world, perhaps society will have had to start off from square one at some point, and things will have progressed much the same way they have throughout our history. Or maybe the people of the far future will have learned to get along, and conflicts will have been brought down to a minimum. We have no way of knowing, as it's impossible to predict the future, especially when horrific conflicts are still alive and well in the world that we're living in now. Despite the conflicts that continue to rage following the elimination of the Titans, maybe this young explorer we see in the far future will find the power of the Titans within this tree of life, and use it to usher the world into a golden age of peace and prosperity, as by all accounts, this power was previously used by a power-hungry and barbaric king who poisoned it with his malice and megalomania, and perhaps this new inheritor of titanic power will use it in a much more beneficial way, and the sins of the Fritz family, Ymir, Eren Yeager, his accomplices, and everyone else in between will be forgotten. So despite all the evil present in this story that results from Eren's actions, and the actions of many, many others, what is the story of Attack on Titan ultimately trying to convey to us? Well, for one, that the world can be a horrid place, and to live is to endure immense amounts of pain. Life is cruel. Humans commit crimes, kill each other, and send their friends and families to fight in wars that are just and unjust, and suffering abounds throughout the entire world. Even so, it's the little things that make life worth living. A mother's smile, a game of catch with your father, the laughs you share with your friends, and everything else in between. The world is not ugly because of the misery that can be found within it. It's beautiful despite it all. And overcoming hatred, acknowledging our similarities rather than dwelling on our differences, and focusing on the things that deserve our love is the foundation of happiness. Likewise, no matter how much terror the world experiences, there is always the chance for peace to become our norm, for suffering, violence, war, and crime to become minimal as we make better choices so that our loved ones and our children are able to live better lives than we did. As Annie said at the end of this series, this world is an outcome wrought by all of our choices, and as long as we all try to make choices that are ultimately geared toward making the world a better place for all, we might just find that evil becomes a thing of the past. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Eren? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, to my patrons, and to anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.